Tonight's lecture concerns itself with David ben Gurion, first Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and in many respects the architect of the State of Israel, whose influence still pervades much of the society. Ben Gurion's name was Green, David Green, and he was born in a little town in the Ukraine, in Russian Poland, in Plonsk. His grandfather was a Hasidic Jew. His father already had become semi-secularized. The 19th century saw an enormous wave of desertion from tradition, from Jewish observance, that swept Eastern Europe, especially the younger generation, to an extent that we would find it almost unimaginable. But it's no exaggeration to say that certainly more than half of the children of religious Jews at the end of the 1800s deserted all religion and followed different ideologies. Ben Gurion's father was a member of the Chova, which was the forerunner to the Zionist organization. And Ben Gurion himself went to Cheder until he was 10 years old, but he already went to a more modern Cheder. By that, I mean that they taught in Hebrew, but the subject matter was purely Torah. And Ben Gurion had some sort of background in Jewish knowledge, though he was far from being a scholar. His father also gave him a secular education by hiring private tutors to teach him, something which was very common also in Eastern Europe, that since the Cheder did not provide for secular studies, so therefore the family provided for it by hiring private tutors. By the time he is 14, he is a ardent Zionist. He was born in 1886, so by 1900 Herzl had already appeared on the scene. The Zionist congresses had taken place, and he was a Zionist. However, not only was he a Zionist, he was a left socialist Marxist, which, at 14, which, and you're never as intelligent and knowledgeable in life as you are when you're 14. From then on, it starts going downhill. And he developed talents as a public speaker, as an orator, and he spoke for socialist causes and he spoke for Zionist causes. By the time he was 17, he was already well known in his area as being a leader. Apparently, he always had a dominant, strong personality, and he always was able to rise to the top, the leadership roles. And most of the time he rose to those roles simply through his own sheer willpower. Ben Gurion, in 1905, when the Great Revolution against the Tsar broke out, so Ben Gurion became radicalized and part of the socialist revolution. And he was arrested by the Tsar's police. His father intervened and got him released. He was arrested again. Many, many great people were arrested by the Tsar's police because the Jewish youth, so to speak, the best and the brightest, pushed towards revolution. And after the revolution was put down, many of them became communists, Bolsheviks, many became even anarchists, even more radical. because the Jews were looking for a utopian solution to all of the problems, and none of the establishment could offer such a solution, and therefore the solution had to be by the complete overthrow of everything that existed in order to build the bright new world that was going to come into being. Ben-Gurion in 1906 comes to the land of Israel. And he comes as a laborer. He worked in the orange groves of Petach Tikva, and he worked in the winery at Rishon LeZion. His experiences as a laborer convinced him that laborers were being exploited. That certainly was the case in 1906. It may always be the case. And because of that, therefore, he formed in his mind the idea that the laborers should unite, form an organization, and so to speak, they would be their own masters. Now, this was in line with Marxist thinking, with leftist thinking, and Ben-Gurion would put it into effect 14 years later when the Histadrut is formed in the land of Israel, the labor union, and by 1923 Ben-Gurion becomes the head of the Histadrut, and that gives him the lever of power which eventually propels him to be the leader of the country. But a lot of things happen in between. Ben-Gurion was a fervent supporter of Hebrew language, to the extent that there was a period, the first 10, 15, 20 years of the century, there was a contest in Israel whether Hebrew or Yiddish should be the language. The Ashkenazim, in their own way, always ignored the Sephardim. And therefore, even though Yiddish could never be the language because the Sephardim don't speak it, that the Ashkenazim felt that that was their problem, but that they did not have to accommodate themselves to that situation. And Ben-Gurion refused to speak in Yiddish, he refused to write in Yiddish, he lobbied against the Yiddish newspaper which the labor Zionist movement sponsored. He said everything has to be in Hebrew. And he was such a strong person that in 1910 at the conference of the Polei Zion, the labor Zionists, which was the name of the organization that he then was associated with, he successfully lobbied that the entire conference has to be in Hebrew. And whoever can't speak Hebrew can't speak at the conference. So it was a very quick and uneventful conference because nobody had anything to say except Ben-Gurion. But his will, I only take that as an example, his will was so strong that he was able to impose his ideas and his will upon the others, even though the others were the majority. And that would be something that recurred many, many times in his lifetime. That was a blessing, but it also was a curse for him, because after a while he developed the idea that he was infallible, that he was always right, and that everyone had to listen to him, and that he had the right, so to speak, to impose his will upon others. So he always spoke about democracy, and he always was a great advocate of democracy, except when it came to David Ben-Gurion, because he reserved for himself the role of being an autocrat, so to speak, of knowing better and of therefore being able to impose his will upon others. In 1910, there's a revolution in Turkey. I mean, so the Yishuv is not going anywhere the first 10 years. It doesn't have many people that come here. In fact, there are years that the rate of emigration from the land was greater than the rate of immigration into the land. And you had terrible conditions, malaria, poverty, the Arabs who never welcomed Jews to the country. And the Zionist dream looked to be absolutely futile. And Ben-Gurion also objected to political Zionism, the fact that political Zionism depended upon what the nations of the world would give to the Jewish people. And whether England or France or Germany would back the idea of a Jewish commonwealth in the land of Israel. And he said that was all useless, and he said that the settlement of the land is the only true Zionism. All else being self-deception, empty verbiage, and merely a pastime. And with that, he dismissed all the efforts of the political Zionists who were in charge of the Zionist movement. And we'll see that Ben-Gurion subverted the leadership of the Zionist movement to take it over and to transform the Zionist movement into what he wanted it to be, and not, for instance, what Herzl or Nordau or Wolfson or Weitzman or Nachum Goldman ever wanted it to be. So he really took on the establishment, and he made himself the establishment. There's a great revolution in Turkey in 1910, 1912. The Young Turks come to power. They attempt to cut the wings of the Sultan. They want to make Turkey a modern country. They're sick and tired of the corruption, of the ignorance, of the fact that the Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe. Ben-Gurion supports them. Not only that, he and Ben Tzvi go to Turkey and enroll in universities in Turkey so they can get closer to the Young Turks, because he has the idea that when the Young Turks will come to power, finally, he'll be able to work something out regarding Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. And naturally, this all turns into nothing. In 1911, he and Ben Tzvi, for the first time, are elected as delegates to the World Zionist Congress. And they begin their rise to the top. He travels throughout the Ottoman Empire. He ends up in Salonika. In Salonika, for a period of time, he worked on the docks as a stevedore. And then when Greece and Turkey had a war and Greece became independent of Turkey, Salonika became Greek. So then he left Salonika and he moves back to Turkey because he thinks that that's where the best things will happen for the Jewish people. 1914, the war breaks out. Now, the Zionist movement remained neutral in the First World War until 1917. The first 3 years of the war, they were neutral. After all, there were Jews that fought for Germany and for Austria, just as there were Jews that fought for Russia, for France, and for England. And the German Jews, the German Jewish Zionists were very loyal to Germany. And they said that if Germany wins the war, then the Zionist movement will have a greater chance than if the Allies win the war. So the Zionist movement didn't know what to do, and it stood on the fence. Ben-Gurion supported Turkey, supported the Central Powers, because he also was convinced that if Turkey wins the war, in the peace that will follow afterwards, there will somehow be room for a Jewish commonwealth in the land of Israel, and Turkey will allow it to happen. However, in 1915, the Turks arrested all of the Zionist leaders in the land of Israel and exiled them to Egypt, to Alexandria. Ben Gurion is also exiled there. There he meets Trumpeldor, who is organizing a Jewish battalion to fight against Turkey. Later it turns into the Zion Mule Corps, it was called. We discussed this when we discussed Jabotinsky. And the Zion Mule Corps is going to fight on the side of the British at the invasion of Turkey at Gallipoli. Ben Gurion was absolutely against the Zion Mule Corps. He said it endangered any chances of the Yishuv in Israel, in the land of Israel, and that therefore support of the Allies was inimical to the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. He then leaves Egypt and comes to New York. He and Ben Tzvi come to New York, where they spend the balance of the war. And he marries in New York a nurse, famous Paula. He writes in his autobiography with great pride that they never were married religiously. Because by now he is anti-religious, not just neutral about it. And after the war ends, and the Balfour Declaration and everything that went with it, so he returns now to the land of Israel. Before then, at the end of the war in 1918, the British made a Jewish legion of 3 battalions of actual soldiers who fought with the British Army. 2 of the battalions fought in the Middle East. 1 of them fought on the Western Front. Ben Gurion volunteers and is a member of the Jewish Legion. And that's how he comes back to the land of Israel. Now you'll remember undoubtedly that Jabotinsky said that after the war the Jewish Legion should never be disbanded, but it should remain intact because it would be the army that would be there to fight the Arabs, because he said there's no doubt that the Arabs are going to make a riot, they're going to make a pogrom, they're going to try and destroy the Yishuv. Ben Gurion was opposed to Trumpeldor, he was opposed to Jabotinsky, and Ben Gurion had a nature that if he didn't like you, he didn't like you. And he didn't like you to the end. So that he really could never let go of his personal grudges. And much of his career was engaged in, so to speak, getting even. In making certain that people that he didn't like weren't able to rise, or weren't able to have influence. He was a master at intrigue, at political intrigue, a master at cutting people out. Now, Ben Gurion had a great idea after the war. Now, you have to remember that this is the communist revolution. Communist revolution in Russia ignited in the minds of all of the left in the world that the world revolution was coming. I mean, that was a doctrine of Marx, that all the working men of the world would unite and drive out capitalism, and that they would end war and poverty and everything because they would all unite. And in fact, that was the slogan of the Marxist movements, right? Workers of the world unite. Ben Gurion believed in that, and especially believed in it regarding Jews. So he said there should be an international organization of Jewish working men. Now, in Europe, there was the Bund, the Jewish labor union, which was militantly leftist, Marxist, militantly anti-religious. I remarked to you that they held their banquets on Kol Nidre night, and that they were the strongest labor union in Eastern Europe. Well, Stalin would destroy them. But he could not get the Bund to join him because he was Zionists, and they were anti-Zionists as well. They held that the cause of the worker erased the necessity for Zionism. That what Lenin called particularism, that the Jews were guilty of particularism, meaning that they didn't deal in universal terms, they dealt only with the Jewish problem, the Jewish state that was small potatoes in this great, great dream of international labor. And so therefore he called for this international labor union of Jewish workers. Well, he couldn't get it going, but he got it going within the land of Israel. That he was able to do. And there's a famous picture of Ben Gurion taken in 1924 here in Jerusalem at the laying of the foundation of the Bet HaPoalim, of the workers' headquarters. And Ben Gurion is standing with the exact same pose of Lenin, with his hand in his pocket, the other hand outstretched. It's an exact copy of Lenin and all the statues of Lenin which appeared in the Soviet Union. Now, whether he did that purposely or subconsciously, no one knows, but nevertheless, to me at least, it's indicative of the fact of the influence of the communist revolution on workers and on the left. And he created the labor union. So first he creates a political party that he calls Achdut Avodah, which is the labor Zionist movement. And he is elected the head of the party. And then he creates the Histadrut, and he is elected the head of the Secretary General of the Histadrut. So he is now the single most powerful person in the country. Now, the power of the Histadrut, which has been diminished over time and is still being diminished, but you see what it takes to diminish it, is due to Ben Gurion's idea that the Histadrut is not just a labor union. The Histadrut is the country. The Histadrut is the Yishuv. The Histadrut owns property. The Histadrut owns the means of production. And for his great coup was that he set up a health program through the Histadrut. So if you wanted to have health insurance, then you had to belong to the Histadrut. And therefore he had thousands and thousands of people who were not labor Zionists, who were paying money into the Histadrut for membership because of the fact that they wanted health insurance. That was not broken here in the country till about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when it opened up and you had Klalit and you had Maccabi and you had Muchedet. All of a sudden you had competition. You didn't have to belong to anything in order to get health insurance. That really was the beginning of the breakup, or the attempted breakup of the Histadrut. Because until then they had a stranglehold on all of the health services in the country, and people always want to need health services. His idea was that all the workers would pool all of it. He was going to make one gigantic kibbutz out of the country. Everybody would pool their money, and then the Histadrut would distribute it according to its wisdom and according to the needs of the people. Now this is pure utopia. Pure, it's communism in its ultimate form. And naturally, it did not work. Now, one thing that has to be said about Ben Gurion, he was an ideologist, but he was a practical person. And basically, when he realized that it wouldn't work, he changed his mind. He changed his policies, he changed his tactics. He adopted programs that were in conformance with reality. For instance, he travels to Russia, to the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, when everybody, all the left, traveled to the Soviet Union to see the great wonders that were done there. And naturally, Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky only showed them what they wanted to show them. So you have the famous statement of John Reed, the American correspondent who went there, and he said, "I have seen the future and it works." But they didn't show him the slave labor camps, and they didn't show him the starvation, and they didn't show him how it did not work. From its inception, it did not work. It took 70 years to collapse. But it was a system that from the beginning had really no chance of working. But he travels to Russia and he proposes that the Histadrut join the Soviet Union Labor Federation. And like, we'll all be partners. And naively, he thinks somehow that the Soviet Union is in favor of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel and will be willing to release millions of Jews to come from the Soviet Union to build in the land of Israel a state similar to the state of the Soviet Union. Well, by that time, Lenin was dead. Stalin was not interested in any Jewish state, and he was not interested in letting anybody out of the Soviet Union. And that, Ben-Gurion remembered that. So in 1948, 25 years later, Ben-Gurion is the one that makes the fateful choice whether Israel will be with the West or with the Soviet bloc. And as I mentioned to you, Ben-Gurion had a long memory, and he remembered things that were done to him and insults that he received and plans of his that were dismissed, and therefore from then on he had it in for the Soviet Union, which really is one of his great accomplishments. Is that, can you imagine, we cannot imagine what would be if Israel would have made that terrible, fateful error of aligning itself with the Soviet Union. Ben-Gurion also saw the rising power of Jabotinsky and of the revisionist Zionists and of the strong opposition to Weizmann, etc. So Ben-Gurion, even though, again, he loathed Jabotinsky, but in his practical, pragmatic way, he negotiated a deal with Jabotinsky by which the labor Zionist movement and the revisionist movement would live together, would share certain powers, and would together work for building the state. However, when Ben-Gurion submitted that agreement to the Labor Zionist Congress for ratification, it was overwhelmingly defeated. He was guilty of his own propaganda, because they had spoken so strongly against Jabotinsky and so strongly against the revisionist movement that they felt that it was treacherous, so to speak, to make such an agreement. And therefore you had the split which existed within the Yishuv, again for 50, 60 years, between the followers of Jabotinsky on the right on one hand and the left on the other hand. By 1937, so Ben-Gurion has got the Histadrut, and he's got Achdut Avodah, and it gains all of this power, political power. He becomes a member, first a member of the Jewish Agency's executive, then he becomes the head of the Jewish Agency's executive. So he's the head of the Achdut Avodah, he's the head of Histadrut, and he's the head of the Jewish Agency. That's a lot of power. Not only a lot of power, it's a lot of money that you control. Patronage, money, all of the levers that are necessary in order to be a terribly effective leader. He becomes disenchanted with Weizmann, And as I mentioned to you, when he became disenchanted with you, he became disenchanted. And even though Weizmann became the first president of the State of Israel, and Ben-Gurion was the prime minister, he never kept Weizmann informed. He never sent them any minutes. He never attempted to allow Weizmann to have any say in public affairs. Pushed him out completely. In 1937, England, because you had riots here in the country, 1920, 1923, 1926, 1931, 1933, 1936. So England decides that the Balfour Declaration was a great mistake. The Arabs are not going to let it happen. In order for England to enforce it, it would take its entire army to do so. They were not willing to expend the effort. And the British Foreign Office was riddled with anti-Semitism. And on top of it, Hitler is on the horizon. So Britain wants to wash its hands of the entire matter. And therefore they propose partition. Going to split the country. A novel idea, right? Been repeated about 10 times since then. It hasn't happened yet. They're going to split the country. And the Jews were given a very, very small section of the country. Less than 18% of the land mass west of the Jordan. The east of the Jordan was taken away by Churchill already in 1920. And the West Bank, the west side of the Jordan, under the partition plan, only 18% of it would be Jewish. The partition plan was opposed by the right, by Jabotinsky, by the revisionists. It was also opposed by many on the left, within Ben-Gurion's own party. But Ben-Gurion and Weizmann and Moshe Shartok, who later was Moshe Sharet, they said even a small state will give us a foothold in the country, and eventually we'll see what will be here. And therefore, whatever they'll give us, we'll take. And that was Ben-Gurion's pragmatism. And therefore, he supported the idea of partition. But nothing came of the partition plan. Because of 1939, there were again terrible Arab riots, and because of the Second World War, the outbreak of the Second World War. England issued in 1939 what they called a white paper. White paper is it's called on the fact that it's printed on white paper. It's an official declaration of the British Foreign Office, the government policy. And the white paper of 1939 said, in effect, no more Jewish immigration. The Balfour Declaration is canceled. The country will belong to the Arabs, and we'll meet and decide with the Arabs together what to do with the Jews. Ben-Gurion organized great demonstrations against the white paper here. The Jewish population in the country then was about 250,000, 250,000. Half of what the Jewish population is in Jerusalem alone today. And he organized these demonstrations. But then what happened was that Italy entered the war in 1940, and the first thing that Italy did was bomb Tel Aviv. Since it was Italian bombers, not much happened. But the issue was brought hard to the fact that they were in the front line of the war. And they also came to the realization that the only ones that would defend them were the English, was Britain. And therefore Ben-Gurion issued his famous statement in which he said, "We will fight the war on the side of the British as though there is no white paper, and will fight the white paper as though there is no war. And during the entire war, the Yishuv was quiet, with the exception of the right wing of Jabotinsky's group that formed the Irgun and later formed the Lehi. So, for instance, they assassinated Lord Moyne, the British general in charge of the Middle East, who was stationed in Cairo. Now, Ben-Gurion was a bitter opponent, as I mentioned before, of these ideas and of these actions. Ben-Gurion himself helped the British round up the people who did it. And because of that, he suffered great criticism from his own Haganah, from the Haganah, and the Palmach especially was the militia of the left. And that's where most of the generals came from. Most of the military generals in Israel's history have come from the left. And all of this was Ben-Gurion's way of being practical. And I don't want to discuss what Ben-Gurion knew about the Holocaust or not. No one knows what he knew. No one knows what his reaction should have been, was. It's very hard to put it together. Ben Hecht has the book Perfidy. There are other things that are written. There are defenses that are written. Can't really know. Have to leave that judgment to higher authorities than us. After the war, though, Ben-Gurion was confident that the British would not enforce the white paper. After all, there are 6 million graves in Europe. The Jewish people were destroyed. And he was convinced that Britain, after having seen the atrocities, what occurred to the Jewish people, simply out of human sympathy, would make provision to enforce the Balfour Declaration. But England at that time was governed by a labor government, so that's one of the ironies, because the labor Zionists here always supported the labor government because of labor and labor. And therefore, in effect, they rooted for the fact that the labor government should win the election. And they looked forward to a labor government. And then what they got was Ernest Bevin, who was a classic anti-Semite, and who enforced the policy not of support of the Balfour Declaration, but of the white paper of 1939 to curtail immigration, to see to it that none of the Jewish forces would be able to get arms. The British lined up solidly on the side of the Arabs. After, in 1946, Weizmann was not re-elected as the head of the Zionist movement. There was a reaction against him. Ben-Gurion helped force him out. And now Ben-Gurion, 44% of the delegates to the Zionist convention were from Ben-Gurion's party. So it was not hard for him to gain a complete majority on any issue that he wanted to. And he, in effect, was running the show. So in the United States, people thought it was Stephen Wise, it was Abba Hillel Silver, it was Nachum Goldman. They were the Zionists that were leading the charge. But in effect, they were powerless. It was Ben-Gurion who was running the entire thing. And he was the chairman of the Jewish Agency. And he was the one that now pushed for a partition plan, because he realized that there was no other way that the Jewish interests in the land of Israel could occur. Britain made an error in judgment. Bevin felt that he was going to throw the matter into the hands of the United Nations. So he felt that one of two things would happen. Either the United Nations would give the land to the Arabs, or if it gave it to the Jews, if it enforced the partition plan, if it passed the partition plan, then the ensuing war which the Arabs would wage would destroy the Jewish community, and Britain would have to intervene in order to save the Jews from being massacred. And when Britain intervened to save the Jews from being massacred, so then the whole Zionist dream was over. That was the Foreign Office's assessment of the problem. We all know that the partition resolution passed. There's a whole series of, Abba even has it in his autobiography. He was then a young man working the Israeli the Zionist delegation. And so people were, the most famous case is the Filipino government, which sent instructions to its delegate to vote against the partition, but its delegate was so drunk that he voted for it. And there were other stories that are not so nice of how votes were obtained. But in any event, it passed 33-13. And the next day, the war broke out, the War of Independence. Ben-Gurion was not only a political leader, he was a military leader as well. And he organized all of the Israeli forces. He is the one that made all the crucial decisions. The crucial decisions where the borders would be, whether Negev should be conquered, whether Eilat should be conquered. He is the one that ordered that the Sinai be evacuated, though Israel occupied a great deal of the Sinai. He's the one who set it all up. And he said how far to go and how far not to go. He also broke up all of the private militias. We all know the story of the Altalena, the ship of the Irgun, which he ordered Yitzhak Rabin to fire upon. And he also broke up the Palmach, the left militia. And he incorporated everybody into the Israel Defense Forces. And he, more than anyone else, strove to make that the army should not be involved in politics. And that the army should be, so to speak, on the same basis as it was in England or the United States. The army does what the government tells it to do, and not vice versa. And that the army, whatever individual political leanings the generals may have, has nothing to do with how the army should work. He comes now to declare the state, May 14th, 1948. He wants a majority of the 10 men in the council that have to declare the state. He wins the vote 6-4. He is determined to have the state. There's no question that if it were not for him, it would not have. America pressured not to do it. The UN pressured not to do it. And within the Jewish community, there were enormous pressures not to do it. And he was the one that said, we're going to do it, and he forced the issue, he forced the vote. He got 5 other people to vote with him, and so it was declared. And he read the Declaration of Independence, which he himself wrote, one of the least inspired of all documents ever written for a momentous occasion. Could have got Jefferson to write it. And the state is born. And they make a provisional government, and he is the prime minister and the defense minister in the provisional government. The first elections in 1949, his party, the Labor Party, wins. It's the plurality, had 42 seats, but it didn't have enough to rule by itself. And he is the one that entered into the 30-year alliance with the religious parties, and he is the one that agreed to the status quo in religious matters, that the government will be kosher, the country officially will be Sabbath observant, but privately people can do whatever they want, and divorce and marriage domestic relations would be in the hand of the rabbinate, and he himself would raise the question later of who is a Jew. He would send a questionnaire to over 40 of the leading Jewish people in the world that they should answer who is a Jew, and he was astounded by the answer that came back. I think 38 of them answered that a person is Jewish only if the person is born of a Jewish mother or converts according to halakha. And many of the people that wrote back were not Orthodox. And that at least temporarily settled the issue with him. So Ben-Gurion runs the country till 1953. One of the things that he pushes through is the reparations from Germany, which again is a very, very emotional issue. Begin and the right opposed it. Begin opposed it so vehemently that he was thrown out of the Knesset. For a number of months he was forbidden to attend any of the sessions because of his vehement language and behavior. Ben-Gurion never forgave him. Ben-Gurion never called Begin by name. When he spoke in the Knesset, he said, "The gentleman that's sitting next to Mr. Weiss." Never mentioned him by name. In December 1953, Ben-Gurion resigns. He says the load is too much. He's carried the thing for so long, which he did for 35 years almost. He's carried the whole thing himself. It's time to retire. He goes to a kibbutz in the Negev called Sde Boker, and there he attempts to build, he wants to build an institution of learning, which he called, it would be the combination of, it would be the Yavne and Oxford of the land of Israel, which would be an excellent combination if it could happen. And he's out of politics, not involved. His successor is Moshe Sharet, who was his foreign minister. But in 1955, a Mossad spy operation in Egypt was uncovered. 2 of them were hung. Others spent as much as 18 years in jail. They were not released until after the prisoner exchange after the Yom Kippur War. And it was a very botched operation. And then people wanted to know who is Achrai, who is responsible for this botched operation. The Minister of Defense under Sharet was a man by the name of Pinchas Lavon. And Lavon was pretty much framed as being the one that was responsible for it. He was forced to resign. When he resigned, the whole government had to resign. Ben-Gurion comes out of retirement. When Lavon resigned, then Sharet asked him to come back as Minister of Defense. Then when the whole government resigned, they had new elections. The Labor Zionists won again, and now Ben-Gurion comes back as Prime Minister. Second time. He conducts the famous Mivtza Kadesh, the war in Sinai against Egypt in cooperation with England and France. And Ben-Gurion built up very good relations with France, which at that time was fighting a war in Algeria against the Arabs. The man that negotiated all of this was Shimon Peres, who was Ben-Gurion's protege. And also from France, he began to get the knowledge necessary to build an atomic reactor at Dimona. It was really the French that helped the Jews build that atomic reactor to enrich uranium, etc., something which is not easy to do. The Israelis win the war, but they lose the peace. Russia and the United States force Israel to give back everything, and they give them promises that the United Nations will somehow guard the border, prevent terrorist attacks, allow shipping in the Gulf of Eilat, and the situation is ended. Ben-Gurion was heartbroken over the fact that he had to give back everything. In 1959, when the elections come again, Ben-Gurion has a new idea. Ben-Gurion is tired of coalition governments. Who could blame him? So he proposed electoral reform, that instead of having proportional representation, which is what we have today, that, for instance, if you get 20% of the vote, then you get 20% of the seats. And you pick whichever people you want. Every party picks whoever they want to be members of the Knesset. Ben-Gurion opposed that system based on his experience. He wanted constituency elections. In other words, somebody would run, let's say in this neighborhood in Rehavia, people would run for the Knesset. And then we would have a chance to vote for the person, even though the people would belong to political parties, but they would certainly be more responsible to the citizenry and less responsible to the political party. It's the system of that's enforced in England, and it's the system that's enforced in the United States as far as the House of Representatives is concerned. And because of that, therefore, he wanted that to happen. However, and he campaigned on that issue, and he thought that he would get enough people to support him that he'd be able to push it through the Knesset. Needless to say, the Knesset does not like to vote itself out of a job. And therefore, when he had to form this coalition government again, all of the parties said, we'll only go with you if you forget this wild idea about electoral reform, and we remain with this idea which we have of proportional representation. Proportional representation permanently assists the smaller parties. I mean, in the last election, if you could get 44,000 people to vote for you, you got a seat in the Knesset. Whereas under the other system, if you didn't get the majority in the constituency where you ran, and then you're not in the Knesset, and you have nothing to say. And therefore, the ability to form a coalition would be greatly enhanced. Ben-Gurion has got a bug in his mind. The Lavon affair. He's against Lavon. He's convinced Lavon was guilty. And Lavon was given a nice job as the Secretary General of the Histadrut. The Labor Party, they took him out of and what happened was they had an inquiry, a commission, and the commission said Lavon was innocent. Lavon was innocent of the charges. Ben-Gurion could make no peace with that. He refused to accept the commission's report. He said Lavon is guilty, and that became an obsession with him. He had to prove Lavon guilty. And finally he came to the Labor Party and he said, it's either me or Lavon. So L'mi yachbotz hamelech yasos yikor yoser mimeni, right? If I say it's me or Lavon, then it's going to be me. But the Labor Party decided it was Lavon. And Ben-Gurion resigned from the Labor Party. And in the next election he made a new party called Rafi. And he took a bunch of all-stars with him, Moshe Dayan, Shimon Peres, Yosef Almogi, and he figured that the electorate will reward him with a strong showing. Well, he only got 8% of the vote. And Rafi fell apart soon afterwards, and it joined together with Achdut Avodah and Mapai, and it became the Labor Party. And Ben-Gurion resigns again, goes back home, but he devotes his life to the Lavon affair. He's going to straighten out the Lavon affair. It's a bug. So here you have an outstanding personality, and you have a great person, and he just can't let go of what is really not only just a losing cause, but a minor. It's a blip on the radar screen. It doesn't make a difference anymore. He then forms another party. In September 1969, in the elections, which took place in October, he had a party called Rishimat Mamlachtit, the state list. And there he received only 4 seats in the Knesset, and he resigned from the Knesset in disgust, and now he goes back again to Sde Boker. So that really, such a life with such a bang ends really with a whimper with what happens here. Now, Ben Gurion had very strange things about him. He flirted with Buddhism. He was wild about the Tanakh, but he saw no connection between the Tanakh and the Jewish religion, which created the schizophrenia which exists in the land of Israel today. That if you study the Tanakh, then then what do you do with everything that it says about God and religion and mitzvot, and that if you don't do the mitzvot, God forbid, terrible things happen, all of that. So you're supposed to know all of that, and you're supposed to win the Chidon Tanakh, and you're supposed to behave like a bohemian. And he took up causes. One of his causes was to readmit Spinoza into the Jewish people, because Spinoza had been placed in Cherem. So he's like Don Quixote tilting with the windmill. He's always looking for causes. And because of that, much of his later life was, was almost silly, nonsensical, out of touch with reality. I don't know if he really wasn't understood what the state of Israel was now and what it was going to be. After the 67 war, he said prophetically, the problem of how to rule over the West Bank will haunt us. And even though he didn't advocate any solutions to it, he was right that the problem still haunts us. And it's almost an insoluble problem. Whatever you do is going to be wrong. And in his declining years, he wrote his memoirs. So his memoirs are, as you can imagine, very much biased towards him and his ideas. There are interesting anecdotes there. His biographers break up into 2 parts, those that are for him and those that are against him. But nevertheless, he was the force, the single greatest force in shaping the Yishuv and in creating the state of Israel. And today is probably his greatest fame is because of the university in the Negev, which is named after him, and the airport at Lod, which is named after him.